Hello and welcome to this channel, a place where we talk about all things makeup related, from comments about the industry, new makeup releases, and consumerism. I generally don't necessarily make a dedicated video talking about a collection launch unless I'm doing a redesign, but today I'm doing things a little bit differently, and instead of redesigning a new makeup release and talking about it, I'm actually going to be giving my commentary and maybe a little bit of a rant or two about one of the more high-profile releases that we've seen this month so far. I'm talking about the new Jeffree Star Cosmetics Cremated collection. I'm going to divide this video roughly into 3 parts. I'm first going to give you a rough overview of what this palette or collection is going to look like. Then I'm going to be talking about ways this collection is incredibly problematic. I have 3 points I want to make, and of course a lot of sub-points as well. But then finally, I'm going to talk about ways this collection could have been executed differently. Not necessarily redesigning this collection, that's not what I'm going to be doing. Instead, I'm going to be talking about how the company could have designed this collection to still have the same theme or the same vibe it did without being so incredibly problematic. This collection was going to be launched in April, however the pandemic kind of brought things to a little bit of a standstill and they had to delay this collection for May. In my personal opinion, this collection should have been delayed a little bit longer than that, but more on that later. On the 16th, Jeffree Star did post a video on his channel that talked about this collection, and I have watched a little bit of it, enough to get a good, in my opinion, a good idea of what his inspiration was and what his motivation was for this collection and what he wanted to emulate. This collection, of course, has been in production for months. However, from what I can gather, Jeffree Star wanted to emulate a little bit of a gothic theme with this collection. He used the word gothic multiple times in his video, and that's basically what he wanted to emulate, and that's what he wanted to be inspired by when creating this collection. He talked about his aesthetic in high school and how gothic it was, and he wanted to draw on that inspiration to create this collection. He also mentioned how within his circle of friends and in his personal life, the word cremated is more of a word that's similar to deceased, and it's a little bit more of a fun term for him to use. One can argue that this collection was a very innocent take on the gothic aesthetic, and in a sense it was inspired by Jeffree Star's own experience. And what's the problem with it? Well, that's where I'm going to segue into the next portion of the video, and I'm going to talk about 3 ways this collection is incredibly problematic. Now, it is nothing unusual for artists and creatives to take inspiration from death and suffering and funnel it into their work. Edgar Allan Poe is just one of the many famous examples of individuals who have done just that. And seemingly, with makeup, it shouldn't be no different. However, I will say this, there is a difference in my mind between being very creative with a theme and just being inspired and kind of taking it a little bit too far and promoting and executing a palette that has repeated emphasis on the various elements surrounding death and, in a sense, trivializing that and commercializing it in a very blatant way draws the question, is it too far? Using words such as gravedigger, death certificate, last look, solemnly swear, last respects, life insurance, pallbearer, the morgue, goodbye, eulogy, afterlife, obituary, mausoleum. Using words such as that, which are elements of suffering and death and something that we all go through and we all feel the pain of, doesn't it, in a sense, attempt to trivialize something that is so inherently tragic, especially when the world is suffering a global pandemic? Jeffree Star Cosmetics, like Angelica Nicholas said in one of her Will I Buy videos, is not an indie brand. They are fully able to delay this release to the summer or even next fall, however long they want, and not go bankrupt. They are fully capable of doing that. However, they chose to release this collection during a global pandemic when people are still dying. In the US, cases are still rising. Nobody has remained untouched by this pandemic, whether it be financially, physically, health-wise, emotionally, and this is deeply traumatizing for everybody around the world. And of course, I think, as I've mentioned before, that this pandemic has really highlighted the disparities between our social classes. So somebody like Jeffree Star might not necessarily feel the pandemic the same way as somebody who is living paycheck to paycheck. Does this collection and palette reflect complete blindness and a sense of tone deafness to what's going on around us? In that way, is it taking insensitivity to a whole new and toxic level? Is commercializing death during a worldwide pandemic really the best thing to do? And is it taking attention seeking to a whole new toxic and insensitive level? I have read a lot of comments from different people regarding this collection, and they range from people who are outraged about the tone-deaf nature of this collection to others who are saying that people are simply being too sensitive. This is a really beautiful collection that is gothic inspired and super inspiring. But people just have so many different opinions. Jeffree Star considers this collection to be a gothic collection, but what's really curious is that even though he describes this collection as a gothic collection, it is very much themed around death. And during this pandemic, it's completely insensitive. I'm going to talk about more ways this collection could have been changed or could have been executed in a way that was less insensitive. But at the very least, the brand could have put out a statement or put out a guarantee that the proceeds from this collection would go to helping people that are affected by the pandemic, would go to hospitals, go to world organizations that are struggling to help people during the situation. However, so far, the brand has done none of that. Moving on, another reason why this collection is so problematic, specifically pertaining to the palette, is the lack of inclusivity. Now, this is nothing new, but really it's just one of the many palettes that Jeffree Star Cosmetics has launched that includes so many very, very light shades that will look completely ashy on darker skin tones. Now, there are ways, in my personal opinion, to come out with a grayscale palette, with a gray-themed palette, without making 2 rows, different shades of cream and white. As somebody who is a little bit of a lighter skin tone, I still look at this palette and I cannot wear so many of the shades in this palette because they would be incredibly ashy on me. And my skin tone is pretty light, all things considered. So I can only imagine how it is for somebody who has a deeper skin tone trying to look at this palette and think of a look. But it would have been nicer to, I think, include some more variation and to definitely replace some of the lighter, whiter, brighter shades with shades that would be a little bit more flattering on deeper skin tones. If you want the lighter shades, keep some of them, but also allow others to use this palette as well. However, I do want to go into the last point. If you look at the palette, one of the names is the Angel of Death. This, combined with the fact that the theme of this palette is cremated, is incredibly troubling to me. Why? Because of some historic events that are related to these 2 words. Why? Because of history. Now, I personally am a huge nerd when it comes to history, particularly when it comes to studying World War II. And if anybody else has looked into World War II, you would have been very familiar with the Holocaust and Auschwitz. One of the more well-known concentration camps, as well as one of the deadliest, was Auschwitz. This concentration camp attracted several medical professionals in the interest of doing experiments on the prisoners within the camp. Now, there were other camps in Nazi Germany that did this, but Auschwitz remains as one of the more notorious camps that practiced this because of Joseph Mengele. I do not care about pronouncing his last name. I literally could not care less. He was a despicable individual that did horrifying experiments on prisoners, on children, that were completely pointless from a medical standpoint, to the point that I personally have just made an effort to not necessarily read into the details of these experiments that were done because they were so horrifying. And as a result, the prisoners within Auschwitz actually nicknamed this individual the Angel of Death because of how horrifying his experiments were and the deadly consequences that his prisoners had to endure. Now, unfortunately, the mythological nature of the Angel of Death, of the term, has been clouded by the actions of this individual during the Holocaust. So when I see the term Angel of Death in a palette, I don't think about the mythological origins of that term, I think of the horrible actions that were done during the Holocaust. Maybe it's not obvious to some, but I definitely think that the connection between the term and the historical implications of it must be pretty obvious for a great number of people, and I hesitate to think that anybody on the Jeffree Star Cosmetics team would have not been aware of this term and the baggage it carries. Added to that, the fact that this palette in general is called cremated. And if you are not aware, then let me just explain to you that the primary way of disposing of bodies during the Holocaust and during multiple dark periods in history would have been cremation. And again, I've already mentioned this, but I'm pretty sure that this could have been or would have been inherently obvious to at least one member of Jeffree Star Cosmetics, and I am very surprised that they actually went through with this, because not only are you releasing this palette, this collection during a worldwide pandemic, and it is not inherently gothic themed, it is themed around death, more so than the gothic, because you don't necessarily have any gothic names in this palette. It is completely and almost exclusively themed around death. So not only are you releasing a death palette during this pandemic, you are also including shades within this palette with names that are completely problematic to anyone who so much as glances at historic events. The last section of this video is where I want to make a few suggestions as to what changes could have been made to this palette, to this collection, to this release, that wouldn't have ended in this collection being so problematic, in my personal opinion. The first way that this collection could have been tweaked to make it better or to make it more inclusive would have simply been to include more inclusive shades that more people could use within the palette. Maybe include a little bit of a stronger gradient instead of just having so many lighter shades and only a few medium to dark shades of gray. However, that being said, I definitely think that there are ways to theme a gray collection that don't exclusively focus on death or cremation, especially if you want to make it a gothic collection. I decided to come up with a few names for this collection, a few alternative names that could have been applied to this collection that were a little bit more strongly goth themed and perhaps better encapsulated the gothic gray nature of this collection as well. These names included Goth Kid, Gothic Vampira, Stone Cold, Stone Goth, Marble Goth, Marbled, and Petrified. Petrified is actually one of my favorite terms because I feel like it would have been edgy and gothic, and the definition of petrified is literally turned to stone. So instead of talking about cremation, the palette could have been a stone-themed palette. It could have still included various shades of gray. It could have included that edgy gothic look to it, but it would have been a little bit more concentrated on the gothic petrified nature of the palette versus making it a palette all about death. So I definitely think that petrified would have been a good way to theme this collection because it's one word and you can just put it all across the palette, and it works in my personal opinion, and it's a lot more unproblematic than cremated, in my opinion. It's a little bit more tasteful. There are so many ways you can take inspiration from your past and put it into a collection that perfectly encapsulates that without referencing death. Gothic themes are usually associated with ravens, with gargoyles, things like that. You can easily just put that in a collection. I think it goes without saying that in today's society, there is an increase in insensitivity in favor of being edgy or cool or in favor of shock value. And the interesting thing is me making a point about the shock value that seems to be integral when it comes to today's society. This collection was in so many ways so inflammatory that I made a video about it. So in a way, I'm contributing to the shock value, and I'm essentially benefiting the very people who let this collection go through. Do you disagree with me? Do you have a completely different opinion on this launch and what it represents? Do you think I'm overreacting? Let me know in the comments below. I will be happy to get back to you, but please keep it respectful, keep it civil, as we all should. But thank you for watching till the end, and I will see you next time. Bye.